Hello, I'm Stuart Pallister. After working as a journalist and editor in Asia for some 2 decades, I switched to thought leadership and research communications at leading business schools, such as INSEAD. Welcome to Leading Hospitality Through Turbulent Times. The series is entitled The World After 2020. And this time we're changing the format slightly. This session will last about 1 hour, and we'll have 5 minutes or so for questions after 25 minutes into the presentation, and another 5 minutes or however many minutes we need to deal with your questions right at the end. Plus, I gather that there'll be some tips and pointers regarding the quiz towards the end, so that's an incentive to stay right to the end. We'll be taking written questions only, and you can submit these as we go along. Before we start, just a reminder once again that the session will be recorded and will be available on the Moodle platform afterwards. And I'll hand over now to Professor Yves Schemeil, who specializes in global and comparative politics, to take us through the next section of his presentation. Professor Schemeil.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Stuart. For those who want to go on discussing or asking questions after 1 hour, I mean, it's still a possibility, we will be there. Right now, I'm now addressing this particular issue, how to build up predictability and limit losses, which is actually well fit to the people who work or will work in the hospitality business. To make your day brighter, I chose this picture of what the future could be in a very long run, actually. Leisure resorts in the outer space, why not? Let's find out how we could get there without being too much annoyed, prevented to make profits, or even deterred to work by the virus. The problem is that when predictability is at stake, the question is, remember what we have said about forecasting, making scenarios, trying to avoid prophecies, etc. But can we have something like predictability, especially in the realm of mobility and tourism and other things like this? We can actually assume that something which is predictable is not completely certain. So what we are looking for is not an ideal of full predictability, which is not even dreamed of in science, in the hard sciences. And we also have to refer to philosophy, because philosophers long time ago said that there is no truth. I mean, the truth is whatever we think is truth, and at some moment is the consensus. There is a consensus among, for example, scholars and scientists on what the truth is. And there might be also a consensus among people who work in the hospitality business to say that that's the truth about hospitality. So we don't know reality, but we have an image of reality. We can have something which approximates reality, and that's already an achievement. We should probably say something like, instead of having the ambition to reach some certitude, let's just try to reduce uncertainty. That's very important, because even in science, this is what physicists, for example, do. They cannot claim that they understand fully the outer space and the universes, galaxies, etc. But they progressively reduce the uncertainty about this world which is beyond our boundaries. So to limit uncertainty, we proceed step by step. For example, if you say, if the answer to a question, what time is it, is 6, well, you never know if it's 6 a.m. or 6 p.m., a great difference. The only thing that you are sure of is, first, it's 6. And then it's not 1 to 5 and it's not 7 to 10. So what you have probably eliminated from the possibilities, the range of possibilities, is that everything which is not 6 it's not actually the time, but you don't know what kind of 6 it is, early in the morning or late at night. To restore predictability, so let's downsize our ambitions. Limit the scope of predictions, because if you want to predict the state of the world, the whole world, everywhere in 50 years from now, of course, nobody is going to take this seriously as a forecast. We have to be very careful about the sources of information, and I come back to this in a moment. So scanning world news seriously and exhaustively with a lot of determination and consistency is important. I can tell you an anecdote. I had a friend who, as a student, was prepared to become an anthropologist by passion. And so he prepared a PhD in anthropology. He got his degree, became a doctor in anthropology, and then at the same time, or nearly so, he became a doctor in political science. And then his father said to him, now that you enjoyed your studies, it's time to make money. So I send you to a place where you learn how to make business. And when he was there, and I asked him, what's up? He said, well, it's hell. I'm in hell. Because, of course, his passion were anthropology, politics, and whatsoever. And what he learned was management, accountability, and all things that you well know, which are very important, of course. And so, in the end, when he got his last degree, he started to do exactly what he had done so far, reading the news. And I asked him, why do you read the news every day? He said, well, because, if you read the news, for example, that in Argentina, if you buy public bonds, now it's going to be a very good bargain in the long run. And so he made a lot of money with rates of profits on buying and selling bonds, which were nearly 15%. At the time, the people in the great consultancy groups could reach something like 8 to 9%. So just because he read the news as someone in political science would do. Then if you do this, of course, you are looking for benchmarks somewhere. You track the signs of change, because when they are aggregated in the long run or even in short run, what you see is that a systemic crisis may be coming. And there are signs that are announcing this crisis. But you have to review everything you can. And of course, this takes time. And there will be an algorithm on the web which will help you to do this. Just scan for you automatically if you have the right keywords. So the problem is how to find the right keywords. And for this, you have to first come back to reading ordinary news as anyone else would do. And you also have to abandon the idea that profit can be maximized, as is taught in business schools and in economics. That's, of course, an ideal way to look at how to make profit. But at some point, when there is a crisis like the one we are in, it's impossible to look for this goal. So we prefer, for a moment, to turn to minimizing losses. When business models no longer work, at least for a period of time where there is a big challenge, in the long run, we can find new ways to create value, because we are all about creating value. You will create value in your businesses. I hope so. I create value when I make a course like this, or I help you to create value. At least this is my wish. So before we return to a period when we can look for maximizing profit, limiting risk will be of the essence. And the motto in our head will always be, it could have been much worse. So satisfaction will get from the difference between what we have, which is not perfect, and what we could have had, which is beyond reach. There are a number of tips which can be given to people who work in hospitality to restore predictability in their sector, at the very least. First, you have to draw a list of possible problems, and this should be as exhaustive as it can be, even though there are problems that your mind wouldn't like to perceive as problems because they are too nasty and too difficult to solve. But you have to be quite honest in doing this. So every risk must be assessed, even the less likely. That's the important part of it, because when you assess risk, usually you think of the risk you already know or the other people already experienced and faced, and so you'll never imagine risks that are probably beyond any likeliness. My favorite is when I teach courses on the Middle East, and I said, the Israelis, in the text they draft and which are transformed into international agreements with the Palestinians and endorsed by, say, the United Nations or the United States, usually they have quite a number of rules and speculations, statements about things which are quite unlikely. But in case they just happen, the Israelis think that it will be a great threat against their nation. So, of course, they didn't do that exactly, but they did think in the Oslo Agreement, which are 100-page long, actually, with all the details, in which are quite like this. Suppose an unidentified flying object lands on a road with ET within, and the road which is jointly used by the Palestinian Authority and by the Israeli government, then who will be in charge of the encounter? And then the answer is, well, if this happens, then the Israeli, if that happens, then the Palestinians, etc. It's, of course, not very useful. But if you start reviewing everything which can happen, well, let your imagination speak and go on that way. If closer to you, you have a starred restaurant, so you're a starred chef, and then after helping a meal becomes a cluster of COVID cases, deadly COVID cases, not only light COVID cases, then who will be held responsible? Of course, if you are a starred chef, I mean, the probability that you are not organized to prevent this is quite nearly nil. But I mean, you should ask this question to yourself, and if you do, then you are well prepared. There are also backup plans, plan B, which are needed, and there are countries in which these backup plans are much more numerous and well thought out and designed than in any other countries, like Japan, Taiwan, for example. They had a reputation for this. And this is a picture of a test or drill in Japan. So among to have plan Bs, you need to have options, and to have options, you need to have additional resources, and some of the resources will be resources which are not needed by now. So if you stick to the rules of the good management, then you should actually get rid of these resources because they are overcapacity. Overcapacity is costly, and you should kill cost. But it should exist somewhere. In agriculture, if you have fields which are on fallow, that means that you can, at some point, if it's necessary, till the land, which for years have been left in fallow. And this is something you find in the whole world since the beginning of the history of mankind. Everywhere, but in the capitalist, well-managed world, people have some additional resource which is not yet in use, even though they are poor, and this is because they know by their own experience that there are hard times, and for the hard times, whether unlikely they can be, however unlikely they can be, they should be prepared. And if you have protocols, which is of course something that you should have, you have to test them from time to time. So if you live in Japan for a while, or if you're a Japanese, you know very well that from school time to when you are in a business corporation, tests are organized periodically, and you have to learn new rules which have been incorporated into this test, and you have to practice them in order to embody them without having to think it over once a new type of challenge is confronting you, or a tsunami happens, or a big earthquake, whatever. And of course, a rule which is well known by managers and decision makers and politicians everywhere, but not always put into practice, is that attention to detail matters. But there are a number of people who don't like to pay attention to detail. They think that there are people who are paid to do this. But if you don't check what exactly those people have understood about what should be checked, and if you don't motivate them, and if you don't review their findings, etc., it won't work. But even though you do all this, you may get it wrong. For example, this is the painting which was painted in 1902 by a Belgian painter. And the interesting thing is that, you know, it's like probably a Blade Runner. It looks like a Blade Runner story. But we are not going with flying taxis to the opera in Paris and elsewhere. Nowhere in the world, by the way, and it's not going to happen, although science fiction films like The Fifth Element, for example, just did this. This is not our life today. So the scenarios that we can make about the future can be close to reality in, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 years from the moment they have been thought out. But then the longer time passes and the least valuable they will be to figure out what the future will really be. Why are we wrong? Well, we are wrong because it's very hard to learn from our predecessors. Rulers, for example, rarely learn from history. Look at what Napoleon wanted to do. He wanted to invade Britain, and he prepared to do so. He organized a whole fleet and the type of apportionment and whatever supplies was needed at the time, plus weapons, etc., which be adapted to the invasion of England. And then he turned to Russia, invaded Russia, and eventually it was a disaster. And then decades after that, a century after that, actually, and more, Hitler came and did exactly the same, with the idea that he could do better than Napoleon did at the time. And so if you want to have an example which is closer to us, look at George Bush and George W. Bush. They behaved, they had the Middle Eastern policy, which was supposed to be good for the Middle East and good for the United States and good for the world. But eventually it became a mess, and this mess was completely predictable, actually, because every scholar in the world knew that if you went into Afghanistan, you would never be able to change the whole society and the political system of Afghanistan for long. And if you went to Iraq, then you will just disband the Iraqis and dismantle the political system, and this will be eventually a type of system as in Lebanon, where you have a lot of communities, and each community has a stake in making the policy decisions. And in the end, it's very difficult to reach a consensus, and each one is facing corruption, clientelism, and remaining stuck into his or her community. So the same errors are repeated century after century. If you read Machiavelli, for example, early 16th century or mid 16th century, then what you see is that Machiavelli got it quite well, because he said that quite a number of things in history, and Roman history in particular, had been seen as errors that you should avoid. And then long after that, people did exactly the same errors. We are wrong also because it's difficult to learn from our mistakes. When you are in politics, your time horizon is short, and that's also true for the economy. You probably know the famous sentence who John Maynard Keynes, great British economist of the 30s of the 20th century, allegedly said, in the long run, we are all dead. So, if we make predictions, it's only about the next cycle, economic cycle or business cycle, and possibly the one which will come after that. But I mean, we cannot go further. And so politics is still is more short. It's even more short-term activity, because people everywhere, even when the democracies are more autocratic and sometimes not at all democratic, then there are elections and there are terms, and people are supposed to apply for a new term, and whatever the ways to get this done, in the end, they need the support of some people who are their constituents. So you are dedicated to your constituents, those who help you occupy the functions and the position that you have now. So it would be very irrational for a politician to target future generations, say we are going to live in austerity for the whole of my mandate and possibly afterwards, because those people who are not yet born will benefit possibly from this sacrifice. What the politicians have in mind are contemporary voters. And also, we don't see what you should see. When we look at the outside, the environment in which we live, the world in which we are, we discard the point of view of the others. We think that we are right by definition. This is taken for granted. So, of course, if I change position and I look at something from a different viewpoint, I could achieve another state assessment of what is happening. For example, quite a number of citizens think that if they were the head of their state of their government, well, they would be able to make better decisions. But I mean, if they were in that position, they would see that there are a number of constraints which would prevent them to make better decisions than their current rulers. As for governments, they most of the time try to, as we have seen already, compare what they are seeing to something which already happened in the past. So any new information is processed with tools that were elaborated decades ago, because the assessment is that, or the assumption is that it's the same thing, which is never the same thing actually. And so the beliefs that we have when we do this are already outdated, and probably they are outdated because they have been taught by people like me, who were taught by other people who are just died, are dead by now, etc. And so sometimes it's a long process of knowledge which take its roots far away in the past. So to draw lessons from the past, we have to identify the source of ignorance, like lack of historical culture. Well, that's a problem everywhere, because there are a number of people, including a number of people like me sometimes, but other people like you, who cannot know everything which happened since the Romans, at the very least, or the Greeks. We have no or not enough contradictory public debates to interpret these past events. And the process to retrieve experience and share it collectively or among individuals are not at all considered as a must. So this is why we don't learn we don't learn about the past. We don't draw lessons from our mistakes. Okay, Stuart.
Yeah, I think we've got a few questions, so it might be good to take a short break here for a few minutes.
Okay.
One question is, which book of Machiavelli would you suggest? I presume.
Well, you have The Prince, of course, everyone knows, but I mean, the most interesting one is the is it how do you say in English actually? Teach livers. That's, I try to find the right title in English while we talk.
Okay. There was a comment about Lebanon, that in Lebanon right now, the problem's not between different communities, but the people against the government. So anyway. And
discourses on Livy or Livy, I don't know. That's the title of the book.
Ah, right, okay.
About Lebanon.
The Prince, though, is easy read and it's quite short. So personally, I would go with that one. And then it's a question asking whether you could elaborate a bit more on the issue of overcapacity that you touched upon in terms of predictability and kind of setting out contingency plans.
Okay. I start with this. When people who are experts in agronomy went to countries in Africa, which are poor countries in which people are sometimes starving or at least are underfed, etc., underfed. They came with their own training and thought that there were ways to improve the yield of the land and have better greater yield in wheat, corn, or manioc or whatever. And so they found out that the number of properties were not at all exploited. And so they said, well, it's a mess. When you have a property and you don't till the land there, why? And people used to say, we are still there after hundreds of years of surviving or trying to survive in a very difficult, tough environment. And the reason why we are still there is because at one or two occasions, we needed to till this land immediately to face the risk of starvation. And so because of this, we used to have an overcapacity. And of course, we are conscious that we could do else, we could do differently, we could proceed differently, we could till the land, and we could be much more comfortable by now, but then probably we will disappear in the long run. So that's what overcapacity means. So about viruses, if we had strategic stocks of everything we need to fight the virus, whatever the virus is, because there will be others, then we'll be prepared to face harsh times when another challenge comes, and in the meantime we lose money, and that's of course a big problem, because you have to make options like dismantling an obsolete and isolated local hospital with no sophisticated facility as we have in bigger hospitals, for example, more central and with number of people from the academia and researchers, etc. But if we do this, then we lose some capability as the Germans have right now, for example, to accommodate all the victims of the COVID locally and quickly, because the beds were empty. So that's what I have in mind about overcapacity. Now, about Lebanon, well, if this remark comes from one who is a Lebanese, the idea is that, of course, ideally, we would like to think that the demonstrations in the streets that started a year ago or more are the proof that it's not about differences in religion, for example. It's about the fact that the people are governed. It's about the governance. And of course, it is about governance. But the way to solve this problem is always a way which is framed by the sectarian oppositions in the country. And so it's very difficult to make the sects collaborate together on a global project and forget about these differences and whatever was their fair share of the cake in the past. And so everyone agrees that it's not good governance, but there is no way to get rid of this bad governance and find a better one.
Just to go back to the overcapacity issue, I suppose that if governments had planned properly and had proper contingency plans, they would have had overcapacity in place so that hospitals would not be overwhelmed. They would have had sufficient, or maybe nearly sufficient numbers of staff, nurses, doctors, ICUs, ventilators, and so on.
That's right, Stuart, perfectly right. But look at what the problem is now. If you want to train nurses, and especially to face, to make them able to face such a dreadful type of disease, then it will take what? Probably 8 years or before they are operational. And so you have to invest lots of money and time and efforts into some direction, and sometimes you are not quite sure that's the right direction. Or when the events happen, then what is obvious at that time is that it was absolutely not adapted to the future events. So it's very difficult. So actually, the problem is that you should have a lot of overcapacity, not some overcapacity. A lot of. And of course, since we are short of everything, everywhere, especially, of course, in the global south, but even in the global north, we are short of a number of resources that we would need, and that would be more equitable and fair for a number of people who are deprived of this, even in rich countries. Well, of course, we are not very much prepared to spare a lot of money for future generations or future events, which might happen or never happen. Because we know that it's a large amount of money. Take the problem of the how fair it would be to, what kind of salary would be fair for the French nurses, who apparently are paid less than the average in the OCDE. When, of course, it should be something like 600 euros. But there are so many that you cannot do this. You just cannot do it, because if you do that, you are going probably to abandon the idea of welcoming new students in medicine somewhere, etc. So it's a big challenge, actually. But we should not accept the idea that a good management and good governance is to get rid of any overcapacity everywhere. Just in time, when you need masks, we will produce this mask when you need them. Well, probably it will be too late.
Yeah, that sort of just-in-time mentality doesn't really work in this sort of crisis. But anyway, okay, those are the questions so far. Maybe if you'd like to continue, and then we'll have some more questions at the end.
Okay, so let's go. So the problem is to get accurate knowledge. It's not to know a number of things about nearly everything. So we all know people who are able to give you their opinion about why is it so somewhere, and they have an answer. It's a ready-made one. That's not an accurate knowledge. Accurate knowledge is difficult to reach, and it's even harder to share this type of knowledge, because once you have it, you think that you have some comparative advantage, and you don't want to get to abandon this. So evidence-based collaboration is difficult. So if you want to do this, you should abandon part of your capacity and your power. But this, of course, can be retrieved at any point. But I mean, people are reluctant to do it anyway. And of course, governments are even more reluctant than ordinary people to do it. And there are always a risk of defection, which means that treaties, international agreements, and framework conventions whatsoever can be but scraps of paper in the long run. And so you are not sure that whatever effort you make to share your information or your knowledge is going to be useful for you in the long run, because of this possibility that delegation is it comes to an end, and you are deprived of something which was pooled so far, and you accepted to give part of the resources needed for the pool to work, and then also that people will just abandon their former commitments under any possible pretext. So to reach a stage of collaboration, you can just say that you will cooperate as as far as it is needed, but not more. And this is also some obstacles to sound collaboration, which would be really instrumental and useful in solving issues. Because there are, for example, governments which just exchange information. And possibly this is what we can expect from the WHO. There are people who will bring information and share it to a minimum, and they would just pay lip service to coordination, just to show people that they have goodwill, but also because they want to organize the division of labor in order to avoid overlaps and costly overlaps, etc. But it's not exactly a commitment to a real cooperation, as you have seen with the COVID crisis at the WHO level. It takes time to progressively abandon these reservations and stop showing too much reluctance towards cooperation. Now, if we turn to hospitality, which is your sector, in normal time, we can assume that information is free. If you ask me the time, I give it to you. It's 11:36 when I still have it on my computer. I didn't lose it because I passed it to you. It's not like giving you a sandwich that I'm trying to eat and then I don't have any more sandwich and you eat it yourself. So that's why the assumption is that information is free. And you can have examples of this with the platforms which make customers and hotel owners and restaurant owners in connection with each other, because they don't charge you. Actually, on paper, they don't charge you anything for that. It's free. But in time of crisis, things are changing. Reliable information is invaluable, and reliable means that information that probably a number of others won't have, which is called in theory, it's called private information, and information that you have and that other people don't know you have. This information is particularly precious because it is reliable, it has been tested, it's something that others should also have, and you also can negotiate, make trade-offs about passing this information to others freely. Hence, the big question becomes to which extent available information is adequate to the facts, because there is information everywhere, but quite a number of these news or these analyses are not adequate to the facts. Take the example of the World Tourism Organization and the World Health Organization. They think that they can share knowledge in hospitality, and they should. So they met early on during this crisis, and they came out with the statement that the response to the crisis must be proportionate, measured, meaning evaluated, assessed from time to time, and based on the latest public health recommendations, meaning that the WHO is leading and the UN WTO is following. They promote together solidarity, collaboration, they are an example of collaboration, and concrete action across borders, because it's important for the number of people who are working in this sector everywhere. And here you have the two heads of this respective organization, Zugavdashvili for tourism on the left, and Dr. Tedros for the WHO on the right. That's a recent picture. Now, if you turn to the business, the hospitality business itself, there is, for example, the International Hotel and Restaurant Association, which had to say something about the crisis, of course. And as you will see in the next slide that you will read carefully and quietly when we are no longer online, they work on distance. I mean, what they say is that we should focus on distance in time. I mean, there will be better times in the future. There have been hard times in the past, and we overcame that as well. A distance from home. If we go for a holiday, we should not go on the other hemisphere, to the other hemisphere, for example, and we should probably stick to 100 to 200 kilometers from home. Distance with people, that's social distancing, and how you make room for this in space, like in hotel rooms, halls, etc. And these are some of the analysis made by under the umbrella of this business association, International Business Association, to help their members to face this crisis. Now, if you turn to business consultants who operate in this sector as well as many others, they bring less specific advices, and it seems to me that it's a type of advice that are trivial. I mean, we all think this without passing through with asking for the help of so-called specialists, because these advices are very I would say common sense, commonsensical. You see, prepare for a disaster. The important thing is preparedness. I mean, if we are not prepared, of course, things can be even worse in the future with other challenges that we are not aware of by now. And you should prepare for the continuity of your business. I mean, again, try to figure out what kind of very unlikely event could happen and think, in that case, what should I do? To prevent future damage, be proactive. So don't wait for advice to come for support from the government and funding from your authorities to accrue to you. Just start to take initiatives. And I leave you with this for later use. Now, if you turn to the UN World Tourism Organization, what do they say? That's more interesting because it's more specific, of course, more accurate and adequate to the tourist sector. What they say is we still do not know what the full impact of the COVID will be, so we are in a state of incertitude. We must support the sector now because we come back stronger. So sustainability is about having bad days and better days. Recovery plans will translate into jobs and economic growth. So if we have plans which are adequate to the situation, then in the end, we will be stronger. That's the statements made at the level of the World Tourism Organization. And to prepare for the worst in hospitality, they have 23 recommendations. And as you see, they packed them into three groups. Mitigating the impact of the crisis. This is exactly what we try to do with climate change. We cannot prevent climate change, we can mitigate the impact of climate change on us. Accelerating recovery, so we can wait for recovery to occur. It will occur at some point, but when? So we can do everything we can to accelerate the pace towards full recovery. And also we can have an initiative in, for example, mandating people within the Global Tourism Crisis Committee, and they will be able, as experts, to give recommendations to people who are working in hospitality. And this is a good example of the type of collaboration that I advocated or I presented at the very beginning of this course last week, as you can see in the last paragraph. So further cooperation between the UN, WTO, and the WHO and others is needed, and there is a commitment to go further to reach a coordinated response with guiding principle, and look at this guiding principle for a while. International cooperation, responsible leadership, who is concerned with this idea that some leadership cannot be responsible. We may ask question. Solidarity and responsibility altogether. I mean, solidarity goes with responsibility, although it's a collective way to help people. Responsibility is individual, and we are all responsible for our deeds and opinions, but both should be combined. And what we can say, what I could say, well, I know for sure, and you know, that divergence is great in health estimates. If you look at the figures which circulate, we are not quite sure about the percentage of people who are asymptomatic. Yeah, experts who say or said 10%. Now the latest figure is 45%. That means nearly one victim of the COVID out of two has no symptom at all. Probability to be infected, well, 5%. That's what some experts said, especially about Germany. 30%, 50%. We don't know. And there also are people who argue that if we achieve a 50% rate of exposure to the disease, then we'll all be vaccinated against it. And the distance to respect when meeting people, you know, in France, we stick to the idea that 1 meter is enough. When Germany, it's 2 meters. The latest news from the WHO is that if someone is running, then it's 10 meters. So when you are confronted to figures like this, what is the most sensible way to respond to this? Well, is to opt for the worst estimate. So even if the likeliness of the worst estimate is not the highest, you look for the worst estimate. I myself, for example, I keep a distance of 6 meters at the very least of anyone, and if someone is running, it's 10 meters. A kind of restaurant owner makes profit if each client sits in a 4 square meter space. That's a good question, but we should opt for 4 square meters and not complain about it's impossible, my restaurant is too small. Well, solutions have to be found, and they will be found, by the way. And the problem, of course, is the rate of profitability, because there are extra costs, but also this can be adjusted. And there are a number of people in the business who do this. They don't discuss. I mean, the problem is, do not discuss the worst estimate. Just take it for what it is, take it for granted, and work on it. And then, of course, you have an extra room for maneuver if the worst estimate is not eventually what will occur, actually. If you, knowing if you have to share, you will share or not the knowledge acquired in hospitality, the sound knowledge acquired in hospitality, depends on something else, which is a correct understanding of what is really happening. Because a number of people, when just being witness of an accident, for example, they won't be able to know exactly what's happening. I'll give you an example. During the Lebanese civil war, I can give an example from Lebanon again. During the Lebanese civil war, there was the invasion of Lebanon and Beirut by the Israeli army, and at some point, the Palestinian camps of Sabra and Shatila were encircled by the Israeli army, and the Christian militia were allowed to step in and do whatever they wanted to suppress the terrorist movement within these camps. And one of my friends, who was the corresponding journalist of French media on the spot, just came back of a very difficult day in which she was the witness of a number of atrocities. She was completely exhausted. She came back with her cameraman, and they just wanted to have some rest. And then there was a call from Paris in the middle of the night. They said you should go to the Palestinian camps in the surrounding Beirut, of Sabra and Shatila, because something big is happening there. So they complained about, they wanted to recover, etc., and say, no, you have to go. So they went there, and they just had they just were admitted into the camp, and they saw a number of things, and they even shoot the events on live. And so what was the confession made to me by this journalist years afterwards. They said, at that time, we did not understand anything of what we saw, whereas they were experts in the Middle East, etc. But you know, the importance of understanding what's happening exactly is really it's really important. It's really strong. So if we go back to what we have seen, misperception, biases, etc., and ways to avoid them, the best example we have is there are a number of political leaders who said that, you know, it's just an ordinary influenza. I mean, the risk taken in that case are very high, and probably quite a number of countries will see how making such a hunch, which is completely disconnected from reality, could have an impact on the number of on the death toll. And then we see. We also have to translate raw information into sophisticated, refined knowledge. So to do this, defining the situation in which we are, the context, and understanding it is of course of the essence. Is the situation risky? And to what extent? One of my favorite examples is the case of a mother and her daughter who go shopping in a mall, and they pass by a sport shop, and in front of a sport shop there is a group of youngsters who look very much like a gang, and who are very quiet, by the way, and so they don't pay attention to these youngsters. They go shopping, and then when they come back, at some point the owner of the sports shop goes out and says, he warns the two women and say, you know, it's dangerous here. You shouldn't shop today, etc. And he looks at the group of youngsters, and so what happens? Suddenly, the situation changes for these women who had fun for about an hour or so. And then they feel they are in danger, they are threatened, so they run away. And the youngsters run after them and say, "Hey, oh, we are not dangerous. We don't want to threaten you. No. This man says not. What he says is nonsense." And so they run and they run and they run and run again to their car. So the situation defined when they came in was it's calm, quiet. People have fun. Even youngsters are there and they have fun, and it's normal. And then at the end, someone make them worry about the situation. The situation suddenly changed in their mind. It didn't change in reality. So assessing the risk is complex. And so sometimes we need to turn to enlightening precedents to the current events to understand what's happening. James Rosenau, whom you can see on this picture, was a very famous professor of international relations in Princeton for decades. He wrote very important books and papers, and is as a root of a very important scientific journal on international relations and governance, etc. And so his answer was that if you really want to progress in understanding what's happening, you have to ask yourselves this question: of what this is an instance? Of what this is an instance? So I'm the witness of something. And this something is an instance of something we know. We have been analyzing for years. Scholars have published scientific articles and books on it. But what kind in particular? So I would like to know: are we in a civil war? Are we in an international civil war? Are we in a world war in the offing? Are we in social strife or whatever? I mean, I need to know. With this crisis, is it a normal influenza which has been more deadly than any other due to the fact that we are not quite prepared to face it? Or is it something quite different from what we have experienced so far, except with the SARS-1, etc., and that it's going to repeat in the future? And of course, the answer matters a lot. So if we ask this question, as James Rosenau would have done, of what the COVID crisis is an instance, well, there is a first explanation. We are witnessing a decline of classical diplomacy. I mean, people are no longer trying to communicate by formal channels, so there are statements which are made at the top of the states, sometimes very hastily, and with no ground to say this, contradictory things are said, and etc. And people on the social networks, of course, use every kind of information and disseminate it, whatever value it has. And you also can get sophisticated info, like this the quantitative models that have been sought out and designed by epidemiologists. Difficult to understand, but it's available on the internet. You can make your own comments, and then nobody knows if you are a well-established expert or if you are just someone who read the news. So checking for unverified tweets or message posts, etc., is very difficult, and confusion may come out of all this. So because we don't let the people who are trained to deal with exchange of information between governments, then we have a lot of problems unfolding from that. Second explanation, it's a threat against multilateralism and cooperation, meaning that states are pulling out of negotiating platforms in international cities like Geneva, New York, Vienna, and whatsoever. And there is a competition for a number of assets that are much needed during this pandemic. Priority is given to the nationals, and coordination is lacking. Well, very recently we have seen that even within the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson was not able to get the full cooperation of Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. They all have their own lockdown agenda, and it's not synchronized. Within the USA, you have seen that California and New York, for at least, had very different policy from the federal administration. And within the EU, the opposition between northern and southern members of the EU has been, once again, very much obvious, unfortunately. Third explanation, are we returning to protectionism and national sovereignty, which is an extension of the previous one? The International Division of Labor is considered as being biased, and notwithstanding this, in health, national sovereignty is now preferred to international solidarity. So, solidarity is good in a number of realms, and in normal situation now, when we are drowned into such an ordeal, then we can return to national sovereignty and help the nationals, our citizens. Policy measures diverge from one stage to the next, and from one stage to the next in each state, actually. And last but not least, states hijacked mask and tests in rush for coronavirus protection. So, we have seen things which are quite illegal actions on tarmacs in Praha, for example, and elsewhere. Fourth explanation, decline of Western values, mind you, not less, because we are in such a situation, because electoral democracy, respect from political freedoms, toleration and recognition of the others and the minorities, and combining welfare systems and solidarity with individualism, etc., are not very effective when we are challenged by things like climate change, like pollution of the environment, plastic ocean, and by a virus like this one. So how we could choose between these different explanations? Well, we have to contextualize the current crisis, compare past and present, and ask if national leaders were more prepared or less prepared than current leaders to share their knowledge in the past. And for example, as you see today, yesterday, there was this World Health Assembly online, organized by the WHO. I don't exactly know what are the outcomes and what the final resolution is. Probably will be out today or tomorrow. But the interesting thing is that they go on working together, and they show that they can share their information, and they also make a claim that if there is a vaccine, this vaccine against the coronavirus should be a global public good, something that we have seen in previous sessions. So we are now at the end of this session, and we understand better why classical diplomacy, classical channels to communicate are been so much impaired and even destroyed in recent years, to the point that when we are facing such a crisis, we are actually lacking the resources we should need at that point. Thank you very much.
Fine, great. And that's exactly 12 o'clock, so some nice timing. We have one question, which was about lip service, what you mean by lip service, and in terms of national leaders, whether they're prepared to share information. Presumably, they're just going through the motions and not really sharing critical information.
Okay, lip service is just that it's something that you consent to say, but you don't believe in it. It's just because you want people to think that you really are committed to this. So I support peace between the Israeli and Palestinians. All right, but I don't do anything about it. I don't care. This is not my problem, and I have other issues to solve, etc. So if someone is relying on me to support a solution at the UN Security Council, I would say, yes, I will support this solution. Actually, I don't care. That's paying lip service. Probably Germany pays lip service to the idea that the European Central Bank should buy public debt, Corona bonds, for example. They will pay lip service to it in order to know if they are really they mean business. They are very serious about that. We need to wait a little.
So that's all we have in terms of questions. I don't know whether you want to say a few words about the quiz.
Yes. Well, you see, the quiz is for fun. I mean, for you to test your ability to take stock on this course, check that you have understood what were the points addressed, and also the idea is that there is one best and better answer in each case. So just please think it over. Take your time to answer the questions, because at least there are out of 4 possibilities, 2 might be simple for those who were attending this course to find out easily and just to discard from the very beginning. But probably among the 2 which remains, there is one which is plausible. So, and the one which is correct. So my advice would be, take your time, make a pause, come back to it, possibly come back to the recordings of the sessions or the PowerPoint, and in the end, make up your choice. And I hope you enjoy it.
Some good advice. So thanks a lot, Yves. And the next
session
will be on a Monday.
That's right. Yeah. Have a nice long weekend.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Bye, Stuart. Bye, Michael.